Hi everyone and welcome. What you have here in front of us is my oldest worm bin. It's got red wigglers in it. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 125 or so days old at this point. Hey Siri, how many days have passed since June 22nd?
Just a moment. It was 128 days ago.
Okay, just a moment. Alright, 128 days have passed now since this bin was originally set up. And that makes it the oldest of my bins. The second oldest bin is right here next to it. I typically kind of keep them in sequential order in terms of oldest to youngest. And although it's the oldest of my bins, it's really not the bin that's furthest along, at least not according to my estimation. It's this second oldest bin right here that I found to be a little bit further ahead of this oldest bin. And it was because of that, 5 days ago, I had already initiated the attempt at migrating the worms out of the finished compost into a freshly built feeding area on the far edge. And it's still a little bit early to expect that the worms would have made their way over into the feeding area over on the far edge, but pretty soon I would expect to see a pretty good amount of worms piling up over into the feeding area. There's been no food given to this finished compost area for some time now. So I would think that they're getting hungry and hoping for some fresh food. So the aim today is to get this bin caught up. It's been 8 days since I came into this bin last, and the mission at that time was to pull out any sort of large food chunks and bedding bits and stuff like that to try to get the worms to really work down the remaining material in here, any sort of food scraps or bits that I didn't pull out. I was really wanting the worms to focus their attention on that stuff so that we might end up with some really nice finished castings here, and that we might be able to initiate this migration of the worms in here too, the same way we did in the second oldest bin. So we're going to get this oldest bin of mine out onto the bench, inspect the material. If it does in fact look like it's ready for it, we're going to shove everything over to one side and set up a feeding zone on the far end. Try to get that migration activity started in this bin too. 5 days after the second oldest bin, which will hopefully help it get caught up a little bit. The other weird thing here though, which was something I've not seen before in any of my other bins. I mentioned it in a previous video, but before I take these bins off the shelf, I'll probably wipe all this off, but this little trail of compost, vermicompost, it's usually an indication that worms have been, crawling up the sides of the bin, usually in search of collecting moisture on the side of a bin, at least in the case of bins that have coverings. But since I have no coverings, my bins are always pretty dry when it comes to the sides of the bin. Usually a pretty good deterrent, keeping the worms from wanting to go very high if they should come out and try to go exploring. But in the case of this bin, for whatever reason, seems like the worms came up and kept on going, and then it looks like they crawled over and jumped the wall and made their way into this bin. And then this tattered area over here, 5 days ago when I set this horizontal migration up and I had covered this bin with this piece of paper, none of these holes existed yet. So it's really, really unusual. Something I've never seen before, this whole thing of worms seeming to migrate from one bin over into the other. Maybe they sensed the food over there and they came over, but for whatever reason, I don't know why they would have come over right there on that side. But this is such a strange oddity, and I did mention this in my my other video the other day when I was down here. But I figured before we get this oldest of my bins up on the bench to get this migration set up arranged, I would just show that to everyone one more time, because it's such a strange thing. Alright, let's get this oldest bin up on the bench and let's get this horizontal migration set up. Okay, so it seems to me like the setup that we saw in the second oldest bin is pretty good. So I thought that I would follow suit with that and do the same thing here. So I wasn't really looking to deviate much, if at all, from what I set up in the second oldest bin when I build up this migration feeding zone. There's a good number of castings stuck to this piece of plastic here, And I just usually try to make sure I have not left any worms hanging out on it, because I don't plan on returning this piece of cardboard with the plastic covering it. I've got another little plastic bag that I'm going to use to cover up only the feeding area. That entire cover is going to be perhaps a little bit too much. Because once I set up the feeding area, I do want to allow the rest of the material, an opportunity to air out a little bit and start to dry off. Because, as that material does dry, that'll become even more incentive for the worms to make their way over to where the feeding is occurring. Because that's where the plastic's going to remain on top and be the only place where the moisture is going to be recirculating, presumably making that into a somewhat more damp and tempting place for the worms to be. So now sometimes rather than going crazy trying to evict all the worms off of the paper coverings, sometimes I'll just fold the paper covering in half, because the paper is nice and damp, and as long as it's folded in half, the worms should be pretty comfortable with the darkness and be less inclined to try skedaddling away. So rather than trying to evict them all, we'll see if that works. I think they should be okay that way. I've set myself up almost identically to what I did 5 days ago, so I'm going to be following suit with what I did then. Shoveling all the material off to the side in one direction, and then setting up a little balls of bundles, if you will, of food. And I've got a couple pieces of newspaper that I'm going to use for that purpose. And the food that I bought down here is in this little plastic bag. So I'm going to place the food inside of these little paper bundles, position them, add some coffee, add some leaves, and then like I said, cover up the feeding area with plastic, and just use that other piece of paper that we just removed to cover the rest up. And that paper will allow for some moisture to escape, and the plastic covering the feeding area will force the recirculation of the moisture in there. Oh yes, I almost forgot. I've got this nifty little piece of cardboard punched full of holes that I'm going to be using to, separate the finished castings from the feeding area. And the whole idea of the holes is to allow the worms to get through, but with that partition in place, I'll be able to more easily see where the finished castings are relative to the feeding area. So over the past 8 days, since I came in here and removed all of the larger scraps of food and bedding that I could find, my hope was that the worms would come through this material looking for food and break down any remaining bits to a small enough size that we would find virtually nothing in here of significant size, and that what we would be left with is mainly some really nice worm castings. And I believe that that's pretty much what we're finding here. While I'm doing this, I'm attempting to use my fingertips as a way to sense if there's any sort of larger food scraps in here, because when I went through here last time to remove them, I could have potentially missed some. But now that I'm really working towards getting the worms to exit this material, any such food scraps remaining in the material would ultimately serve as a deterrent to keep the worms from having a reason to move out and go looking for another food source. So I really don't want to have anything in here that's going to, keep the worms from leaving. If there's a nice big chunk of food in here that the worms are enjoying, then they'd have no real reason to want to, go searching around to find new food. My hope is that these worms are getting to the point where they're definitely ready for some fresh food, and once I set up the horizontal migration feeding zone, as I affectionately refer to it sometimes, that the worms are really going to be jazzed for heading over there to get a bite of fresh food after all this time, since they've gotten nothing fresh. I mean, it was 8 days ago that I removed any leftovers that were still in the bin, but I believe it was 12 days ago that I had last done a regular feeding of this bin. And there was only 4 days in between the two, so I did sort of change course only 4 days after the last feeding, when I decided that it was time to forget feeding these critters, but allowing them to focus their energy on breaking the remaining material in this down nicely, and giving me some really nice castings. So I mean, one thing that I must have missed last time was this banana stem. And you could tell that they're doing a great job breaking it down. But I think I'd rather have this in the feeding zone rather than out here in the compost, because in the feeding zone it'll be all the more reason for them to leave the finished castings and head over to where all the fresh food's been added. So if I find anything, I'm just going to place those bits in with the food that I'm preparing for them in the little bundles when we get around to it. And I guess little sticks like this I could pull out as well and include in those little food bundles when we get around to it. The only thing in here that you're noticing, if you watched the other video where I did the same thing 5 days ago, is that this material definitely has a far greater number of these little leaf stems in it, these little sticks. And the main reason is that this bin had at one point become really damp, and I placed a whole bunch of dry leaves in here in the hopes that those leaves would absorb some of the moisture, and they did a great job getting me back to a good point where the bin was no longer swamped and too wet. But even though the leaves themselves have been eaten up, or at least the soft part of the leaves, all of those little sticks and stems and the harder parts of all those leaves have been left behind within the castings. So my only thought was that if the worms do continue to see all those little sticks and stems as an ongoing food source to utilize within these castings, then the migration of the worms might not happen quite as efficiently here as it could, only because there is a fair bit of lingering food material still mixed into the finished castings in the form of tiny leaf stems and sticks everywhere. So that's my only reason to think that this bin might take a little longer before the worms move out of the finished castings than the other bin, but that's okay. I've already kind of settled into the understanding that this bin is just going to take longer to get done than the other one, and I think the main thing that set it back was that excess moisture that I had in here, which I had to contend with. And I guess in hindsight, if I had contended with that excess moisture differently, if rather than dumping a whole bunch of leafy matter into here, I had maybe used some other sort of dry material to absorb the moisture, a dry material that would have been more readily consumed by the worms, then I wouldn't have all this stuff littering the castings. So it's kind of a live and learn thing. I've at this point kind of baked in that thinking that once a worm bin gets to a certain age and it's nearing that point in time when I might want to start thinking about harvesting the castings, I need to start using material in the bin that I know will actually have a good chance of breaking down quickly, so that it's not going to be left littering the material as we see here. So that's kind of one of the things I enjoy about this hobby, is that I always feel like I'm spotting opportunities for improvement, and it lets me brainstorm on different ideas on how I might be able to improve the process, improve the results, kind of tweak what I'm doing here to hopefully get better and more efficient results next go around. So I think one of my new bits of thinking is that stuff like leaves are good in newer worm bins, but maybe not so good in older bins that are approaching that point where you want to harvest. So I've got little bits of paper here. My idea was to do the same thing that we did 5 days ago, which is to create 2 little bundles of food. This piece of paper was already used for something a few days ago, and now this is a great opportunity to recycle it and put it to use again. So I'm going to pile these 2 pieces of paper I set aside for this full of food. I'm going to try to divide the food into 2 equal portions. I think what I've got left in the bag is about the same as what I've placed in here now. So this is going to be bundle number 1. Okay. Position it over here on the far edge. Now we can assemble bundle number 2. Okay, I guess what I'll just do is I'll grab the plastic bag and actually dump it out. Hopefully not spilling it all over the place. Alright, it does feel to me like it's a slightly larger bundle than the first one was. Getting good at this. Might be able to get myself a job at Taco Bell one of these days making burritos for people. So I've done the same thing here as we did in the second oldest bin that we set up the same way 5 days ago. So I've created 2 little food bundles here side by side on the far edge of the bin. And the next thing that's going to go in here is some leaves that I'm going to try to fill in these little gaps between the bundles with. But to not have the leaves go flying all over the place, I'm going to start using this cardboard divider as sort of a shield so that the leaves really stay over here where we want them. I don't really need to use too much. I'm just going to use a little bit to try to cover up the holes on either side. And you know, you just heard me say a moment ago, don't use all these leaves with all these sticks and stems because it's going to mess up your compost. True, but you know, I ultimately feel like what's happening over here is for the most part going to get hauled out and moved over with the worms when the time comes to relocate them. So I don't really treat what I'm doing over here in the feeding area anymore as feeding the bin or creating vermicompost anymore. At this point I treat all the ingredients that I use to build up this horizontal migration feeding area as migration specific stuff, not so much worm composting anymore. So just some of my little quirks in terms of, you know, how I have mindsets on certain things. So yeah, we're feeding these worms, but it's no longer for the purposes of, you know, creating more and more compost. At this point, the specific reason for feeding is to invoke the exit of the worms from the finished compost. So now this is the point where I would normally try to make sure that everything I've used to build this horizontal migration feeding area is where it belongs, over on the side, because now we can start using some of this compost here to hold the cardboard in place. So we'll start backfilling here a little bit, and the cardboard should stay right where it belongs over there. So I'm going to keep on bringing stuff back here. Try to keep the finished compost on one side and try to keep the feeding area on the other side. I guess I could have used a piece of cardboard that was a little bit wider to reach all the way to the edges, but this will be fine. So I've got one other ingredient that I want to include in the feeding area, which is coffee. Always got a fair bit of used coffee around here, so this is just another opportunity to make good use of it in my worm bins. And I would think between all of that food that we just added, we're going to have a whole bunch of worms that are really psyched about having a fresh meal, as opposed to what they've been doing recently, which is just cruising around within their own poop, right? So here again, like I did in the last bin where I had set up this migration feeding zone, I don't know, to me it's just aesthetic. I sort of like to have a little covering over the food, so since I consider all that coffee we just added as food, not that I think it's going to attract pests or anything, because coffee I think generally doesn't really cause that. I mean, if we had just pieces of fruit and everything laying right out there on top, then I'm sure that would have a tendency to attract all kinds of bugs and stuff. But coffee in most cases I don't think does do that. So I think the leaves on top are really more of an aesthetic thing, just to make it look different. And there's not much left to do here. I've got some coverings. We're going to put plastic on. We're going to put paper here. But before we do that, let's just level things off here. I always like to try to level off the material in my bins. There again, I like to use anything I can to provide me with clues as to what's happening in the bin. And usually a nice level bin offers you the opportunity to observe, maybe a ditch or a hole generating in one specific area where something might be happening. So it might just be a clue as to something that you need to check on by seeing that a bin is starting to lose that nice level surface that you left when you were last in there. So if there's suddenly a big void occurring somewhere, then just gives you the chance to investigate, just in case it might be a situation that needs your attention. There again, just these little opportunities to do little things that maybe in the long run might end up helping you out a bit. So the material in this bin is really nice. In certain cases, like what I'm showing here, it does seem like maybe the material is a bit damp. Not terribly damp, but a little bit damp, a little bit clumpier than you would want it to be. And that's one of the reasons I'm going to be covering up only with paper at this point. Like I said earlier, that cardboard with the plastic wrapping is not going to be used to cover this anymore. It's only going to be that piece of paper that we removed earlier. So let's get that back in place. Oops. See, a couple worms fell off the paper when I removed it from where it was a moment ago. I'll have to go fetch those little guys and get them back in here. Let me do that really quick before I lose track of these little guys. I guess all these castings, once it dries off a little bit better, I should be able to remove it from this plastic more easily and just flake right off. I could drop it all right back into the bin. So I've got a feeling, since this piece of paper is just going to sit out here in the air, it's going to dry off pretty quickly. So the worms are not going to be wanting to hang out on top of it anymore the way they've been. They're going to retreat down into the nice comfort of the worm bin. So we won't be greeted by a bunch of worms next time we come in here. So the only thing remaining, I guess, is to cover up the feeding area. I think I'll go ahead and just leave this piece of paper draped over the feeding area. It's a little bit more cover to keep the moisture down in there, but what's really going to be keeping the moisture down in there is this sheet of plastic. It's not edge to edge, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So all that frozen food that we just placed in there, all the moisture content of that food material, as it starts to break down, as it starts to thaw, as the worms start to eat it and everything else, that moisture is not going to just be lost to the atmosphere. It's not going to evaporate out of the bin. It's going to remain right down here, and that's just going to become another reason to go over there. The worms are going to sense not only the food source, but the recirculating moisture that's going on over here, and combined with the fact that the material on this side at this point is going to also be allowed to dry off a little bit better, we're hopefully going to trigger that behavior in the worms that we're hoping for, which is that they're going to be drawn to the food, they're going to be drawn to the moisture, and for that matter, they're going to be drawn away from the dryness occurring in here, or drying that's occurring in here. And I guess we'll have to see. Hopefully we'll start seeing some good worm movement soon. So we might check in here in another week or so and see how things are progressing. The other bin, since it's already been doing this for 5 days now, we might actually check in there in a couple days. I didn't want to bother with it today. It's only been 5 days. But I'm hoping that maybe in a couple more days, maybe, after it's had a week for the worms to, try making their way over to where the food is, maybe we'll actually start seeing a pretty good worm turnout over there. So, yeah, we might be visiting back in here on my 2 oldest bins again in just a couple more days to see how that other migration is progressing. So, all right, that's pretty much where we stand. I've got a few things that I need to clean up and put away, but not much, luckily. But I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. Before I shut the camera off, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye now.